5,000 Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked on the fires devouring Los Angeles. From rooftops to city squares, smoke curled into the night as sirens wailed and glass shattered beneath angry boots. In the heart of it all stood J.D. Vance, his face lit by the glow of a city on the edge. And in that instant, with nothing but a microphone and resolve, he spoke. His voice didn't just rise above the chaos, it cut through it, sharp as steel. What did he say that turned riot into silence? What line stopped a mob in its tracks? Now we take you into that moment, where courage met catastrophe and history held its breath. The story you're about to witness draws from real hopes, real fears, and real resilience, though woven through with imagined moments that help us feel the weight of what could have been. This is not history as it happened, but a reflection of the emotions that live on when cities burn and voices rise. Let it stir you. Let it challenge you. And above all, let it remind you that truth is often found in the heart as much as in the facts. This isn't just a story. It's a moment that will stay with you long after the last word is spoken. Now let's step into the fire and hear the words that changed everything. Los Angeles, a name that once meant dreams, shining lights, and endless promise. But tonight, that promise lay in ashes. The city burned, and with it, something deeper: trust, hope, order. Fires raged along streets that only days ago bustled with life. Storefronts that had displayed bright signs now stood shattered, glass crunching under the boots of looters who moved like shadows beneath the orange glow of destruction. Smoke curled into the night sky, choking out the stars. Sirens wailed from all directions, overlapping in a desperate, discordant symphony of a city on its knees. Above, the deep thrum of military helicopters sliced through the night air. Their searchlights swept over rooftops and alleyways, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to chase the rioters as they chanted. Voices raw with fury. No border, no nation. The words echoed off concrete walls, merging with the crackling of flames and the distant sounds of shattering glass. And then, the sound that many had been waiting for, and many had feared, the low, measured rumble of armored vehicles entering the city's heart. J.D. Vance's convoy. The sleek black SUVs moved with purpose, headlights cutting through the smoke. People paused. Even the angriest voices dipped for a heartbeat, as if the arrival of these vehicles had changed the rhythm of the night. The doors opened. J.D. Vance stepped out. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. There was a weight in his posture, not just of office, but of responsibility. His face, lit by the mix of street fires and flashing red and blue lights, was a map of determination edged with exhaustion. His jaw was tight. His eyes, sharp and scanning, seemed to take in everything: the inferno of the city, the restless movement of the crowd, the tension in the Marines standing ready at his side. For a brief moment, the wind shifted, carrying the thick scent of burning rubber, scorched wood, and something bitter: the smell of a city's fear. J.D. inhaled slowly. Somewhere nearby, a brick smashed through a window, the sound sharp enough to make one of the younger Marines flinch. But J.D. didn't. He'd seen chaos before. But tonight, it wasn't on foreign soil. It was here, on American streets. And somehow, that made it heavier. The convoy's lead agent approached, voice low but urgent. "Sir, they're pushing toward the federal buildings. We've lost contact with 2 units. Families of ICE agents. They're trapped at the hotel near 8th. They're calling for help. What's your order?" J.D. didn't answer immediately. He stood as if absorbing the weight of that question, of that moment. The flames reflected in his eyes, and for a breath, it was hard to tell if what burned in them was firelight or resolve. How had it come to this? The thought came unbidden, but he pushed it aside. There was no room tonight for reflection, only action. Somewhere above, a helicopter's spotlight swung across the crowd, revealing faces. Some masked, others bare. Young, old, men, women, eyes wide with anger, or fear, or both. Who were they waiting for? J.D. wondered. A savior? A villain? Or simply someone to finally do something? And beneath that thought, another question stirred. one that JD could feel the city itself asking in the crackling fires and broken windows. Could one voice, one decision, turn back this tide? The air seemed thicker as JD Vance took a step forward, the weight of the night pressing harder with every breath. The echoes of shattering glass, the hiss of distant fires, and the muffled roar of an angry crowd became the backdrop to a city that once stood as a symbol of opportunity, now reduced to a battleground. His boots crunched over debris, shards of storefront windows, fragments of signage, and scorched papers that moments ago might have been someone's livelihood. As he moved deeper into the chaos, his gaze swept the devastation. Flags, burned and tattered, clung limply to poles as if too weary to fly. Graffiti, angry and defiant, sprawled across the marble faces of federal buildings. Words meant to wound more than walls. Each site was a reminder that this wasn't some distant land he'd only read about in security briefings. This was home, and it was burning. The faces of the Marines around him, lit by the flicker of flames, showed the same mixture of tension and readiness. JD felt it too, a steady drumbeat beneath his ribs, the sense that the next decision could tip the night towards salvation or ruin. He was still absorbing the scene when the sharp sound of boots on broken glass approached fast. A Marine officer, breathless but composed, stopped just short of JD. His voice was low, urgent, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Sir, we have a situation. Families of ICE agents. Someone leaked their names and locations. They're holed up at a hotel near 8th. The mob's moving fast in that direction. We've got less than 30 minutes, maybe less, before they're surrounded." JD's jaw tightened. That single report hit harder than the smoke in his lungs. It wasn't just buildings at risk now, not just property or symbols. It was people, innocent families, caught in a storm they hadn't chosen. He pictured them. Kids pulled close to terrified parents, hotel doors locked, hoping help would come. And he knew, whatever he decided in the next moments would define more than the night. It would define him. A gust of wind sent a shower of sparks swirling past, carrying the bitter stench of burning plastic and charred wood. Somewhere in the distance, the crowd's chant surged again, louder, angrier. JD glanced that way, the flickering light revealing a sea of faces, masked and unmasked, fists raised, eyes wild with purpose or desperation. His mind raced, but his heart anchored him in the moment, forcing clarity. This isn't a distant war. The front line is here, in our streets. The thought settled in his chest like a stone. He had given speeches about duty, about courage, about protecting the homeland. But tonight, duty wasn't a word. It was this: the broken glass beneath his feet, the frightened families waiting for rescue, the eyes of soldiers looking to him for direction. The Marine officer waited, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. "What's your command?" JD exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the pull of fear, the noise of the mob, the weight of expectation. The next move had to count, and as the fires raged on, as sirens wailed louder, JD Vance prepared to act, knowing the world was about to see what kind of leader he truly was. JD moved with purpose, each step deliberate as he entered the mobile command post. A steel island of order amid the storm outside. The air inside was thick, not with smoke, but with tension. Screens glowed along the walls, casting pale light over the faces of agents and officers, hunched over keyboards, radios, maps. The soft hum of equipment mingled with clipped voices trading updates, coordinates, crowd movements, threat assessments. Outside, the city burned. Inside, minds raced to stay ahead of the flames. JD approached the central display. Live drone footage filled the screen, an unforgiving eye in the sky tracking the chaos below. He watched as one camera followed the surge of a mob pushing down 8th Street, their path lit by fires, their chants still audible even through the static-laced feed. Another drone swept past federal buildings, graffiti scrawled in bold, defiant strokes. "No justice, no peace. Burn it down." A third view revealed the hotel, a lonely beacon of light in the growing darkness, barricaded and silent, where families waited for rescue they couldn't see coming. An agent stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Sir, we've intercepted chatter. Threats are escalating. They're coordinating on encrypted channels, targeting that hotel, federal vehicles, even individual officers by name. We've mapped known locations of the agents' families. They're vulnerable, sir. JD took the tablet, scanning the heat maps, the lists of names and addresses flagged in red. Every data point felt personal. Every dot on the map represented someone who had trusted their government to protect them, and who now sat in the crosshairs of chaos. He took a breath, slow and steady. The weight of leadership was no stranger to him, but tonight that weight felt heavier, because it wasn't born in distant lands or on abstract battlefields. It bore down here, now, in the streets he'd sworn to serve. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried through the command post like a shot. This isn't about politics. It's about protecting Americans abandoned by their own city. We do this right, and we remind this country what law and duty mean. Heads turned, eyes lifted. The room stilled for a heartbeat. Tension didn't vanish, but it focused, sharpened. Orders began to flow again, crisper now. Reposition units, reinforce barricades, ready medevac routes. The countdown had started. Not on any screen, but in the pit of every stomach present. 30 minutes, maybe less. On the screens, the mob grew closer. The fires burned brighter, and the night seemed to lean in, listening. JD glanced at the time, then at his team, at the maps, at the faces of those who looked to him now, not for speeches, but for a plan that could turn back the tide. He knew the world outside wouldn't wait, and as the hum of radios filled the space once more, JD Vance braced himself, because the next choice he made would define not just this night, but what came after. The transition from the mobile post to the war room felt like passing through an invisible barrier. Outside, the chaos of the streets. Inside, the chaos of decisions waiting to be made. The room was bathed in the glow of screens, walls alive with feeds from drones, body cams, surveillance helicopters. Each image told a fragment of the night's brutal truth. JD stepped in, and the atmosphere shifted. Conversations that had crackled with tension moments before fell to a hush, as if the room itself took a breath at his arrival. He moved to the center console, his eyes sweeping across the data before him. There, in brutal clarity, was the reality no one could deny. On one screen, footage showed an ICE agent dragged from a vehicle, outnumbered, struck down as his radio crackled for help that came too late. Another screen displayed still shots, homes of federal staff marked with spray paint. Traitor, enemy, we know where you live. On a map overlay, red markers clustered at these addresses, tracking the movement of hostile groups inching closer, block by block. The city's darkness was broken, not by streetlights, but by the fires of its own undoing. Around him, voices of ICE, FBI, and Marine officers filled the air. Voices weighted with fatigue, some trembling with the edge of frustration. Reports came rapid, overlapping, barricades breached, patrols overwhelmed, reinforcements too thin, too scattered. Beneath every word was the unspoken truth that none dared voice. They were running out of time. JD felt it. The weight of every eye turning toward him, the silent plea for steadiness in a night spinning out of control. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, then drew a breath deep enough to center the storm inside. When he spoke, his voice was low, but carried to every corner of the room, cutting through the din like a clear bell in fog. If the city won't shield its people, we will. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were an anchor, a promise. And in that promise, the room found its focus. The chatter didn't stop, but it changed. The urgency remained, but it sharpened. Orders flowed with new clarity. Reposition squads, secure family zones, reroute evacuation paths. The fatigue was still there, but now it was held up by resolve. JD stayed at the console, watching the screens, tracing the movements of both friend and foe. His mind ran ahead, calculating risks, anticipating what the next 30 minutes would bring. He saw in the agents' faces around him a reflection of his own thought, the understanding that this wasn't just about saving lives tonight. It was about what the nation would remember when the smoke cleared. And as the war room hummed back to life, as data streamed in faster, as sirens outside wailed louder, J.D. Vance stood firm, because he knew what happened in these walls now would determine whether the city found its way back from the brink or was lost to the fire. The room pulsed with activity, but J.D. Vance's focus narrowed to a single task. One last attempt at unity before the night's decisions became irreversible. He signaled to an aide who connected the call, the line crackling softly as it linked to the California governor's secure office. Around him, the war room kept moving. Commands issued, markers updated, the city's struggle mapped in real time. But for J.D., all sound seemed to fall away as he waited for the voice on the other end. "Governor," J.D. began, his tone even but edged with urgency, "I'm asking you directly. Will you act, or will you let this city fall further into chaos?" There was a pause, not the kind filled with thought, but the kind heavy with calculation. When the governor's voice came, it was smooth, practiced, but hollow. "We appreciate the concern, Vice President, but it's clear the federal presence has only escalated tensions. We had the situation contained until your people arrived. What's happening now? It's a response to that overreach." JDD's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He forced himself to unclench it. "Governor, you and I both know that's not true. Your city was already burning before a single Marine stepped onto its streets. Your people, our people, are in danger right now. Families are under threat, officers are being hunted, federal property is being destroyed. This isn't the time for blame. It's the time for action." Again, that maddening pause. Then, "With respect, the optics of federal troops in our streets are making the situation worse. We're managing it. The best thing your administration can do is step back." JD's jaw tightened. He could almost feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of those listening not to the call, but to what came next. The city's map glowed before him, danger zones marked in angry red, advancing like wildfire. The mob's movements tracked block by block, creeping toward the hotel, toward homes, toward the last fragile outposts of safety. He drew a slow breath, steadying the fury that threatened to break through. "I didn't make this call to argue, Governor. I called to give you a chance to stand with us, to stand with your city. But if you won't, then we will do what's right, with or without you." There was no response, only the soft click of the line going dead. JD stood in the silence that followed, the air in the room thick with unspoken understanding. The standoff was over, and the path forward was clear. Around him, the war room snapped back into sharper focus, the noise returning like a wave. Officers awaited orders, agents updated positions, and the countdown continued. JD glanced once more at the map, at the markers tightening around the hotel, and he knew the time for waiting had ended. As sirens outside rose in pitch, as the fires of the city cast shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls, J.D. Vance turned to his team, his voice steady as steel. "Let's move." The silence that followed J.D.'s last words to the governor was short-lived. In the war room, the reality of the moment crashed back in. Louder, clearer, more urgent. Radios barked updates. Screens refreshed with new data. The mob's advance now dangerously close to critical points. The hotel's location blinking steadily on the map like a heartbeat in distress. J.D. didn't hesitate. "Lock down all federal sites. Deploy perimeter teams. Prioritize the hotel and staff residences. Nothing gets through." His voice was measured, but beneath it ran steel. The room moved in unison. Officers relayed commands, agents confirmed positions, maps filled with shifting markers as forces were reassigned. JD stepped closer to the main console, eyes scanning the layout of the city, each red zone like a wound on the map. He could hear the weight of his orders ripple outward, the clatter of boots as units mobilized, the low hum of engines starting, the soft click of weapons being checked, rechecked. Outside, in the night beyond these walls, the city remained a storm, but now at its heart, a line had been drawn. Across federal sites, troops took their positions, grim faces beneath helmets, eyes set on what might come. ICE agents and Marines stood shoulder to shoulder behind hastily erected barricades, their breaths visible in the cold air that seeped in through the cracks of the night. In safe zones where families huddled, windows darkened, doors barred, Children clung to parents as the distant sounds of unrest pressed closer. Silent prayers mingled with the sounds of final preparations. JD watched it all from the feeds, not with detachment, but with a heavy awareness that every command given tonight carried weight beyond tactics. He felt the gravity of the choice made, the invisible line that now separated duty from despair. This was no longer about orders relayed over secure channels or protocols followed to the letter. It was about something deeper. This is bigger than orders. This is about a nation's soul. The words echoed in his mind, steadying him against the roar of doubt that any leader might feel in a night like this. He knew history would judge this moment not by the orders issued or the strategies mapped, but by whether they had stood firm in the face of collapse, whether they had protected what mattered most. The radios crackled again, positions secured, perimeters set, eyes on key routes. JD gave a final nod, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of those who had waited for him to draw that line. Outside, sirens wailed still, but here, inside these walls, there was purpose. The line had been drawn, and no matter what the night brought, they would hold it. And as the city's fires flickered on the horizon, JD Vance braced himself for what would come next. Not just the next hour, but the next test of whether they could keep the soul of the nation from burning along with it. The night deepened, and with it, the storm came closer. On the screens inside the war room and through the sights of watchful troops, the rioters grew bolder. What had started as scattered groups fueled by anger and confusion was now a wave, more organized, more determined. The chants that had echoed in the distance now thundered just beyond the barricades. No border, no nation, no justice, no peace. From the hotel's vantage, the ICE agents could see the mob's approach, a tide of bodies weaving through the debris-littered streets, torches and makeshift weapons in hand. From above, helicopters tracked their movements, spotlights cutting through the smoke, illuminating faces twisted with rage, desperation, or both. The light revealed moments of chaos at the barricades. Angry hands gripping metal, objects hurled, the clash of wood against steel. JD Vance stepped out from the command post into the cold night air, his boots crunching over shattered glass and spent casings left from earlier skirmishes. The tension in the air was thick, a heaviness pressing down on everyone who stood the line. He moved among the troops, his gaze meeting theirs. Young Marines, seasoned agents, National Guard members called up in the city's hour of need. Each face reflected the same unspoken question. Will we hold? JD stopped at one position where a Marine barely older than 20 clutched his rifle, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the advancing crowd. JD placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder, grounding him. His voice, steady and low, carried just enough to reach those nearest. You stand for millions who can't be here tonight, for their families, for their safety, for their peace of mind. And you're not alone. We stand together. The Marine exhaled, some of the tightness in his grip easing. JD moved on, repeating the gesture, a word here, a nod there, as if stitching together the line not just with strategy, but with the human thread that holds in the face of chaos. Above them, the helicopters circled closer, their spotlights dancing across rooftops, alleyways, the sea of faces pressing toward the defenses. The riot's front edge slammed against the outer barricades, not yet breaking through, but testing, probing, looking for weakness. JD could feel the storm's edge as keenly as if the wind itself carried the charge of what was coming. He paused at a command outpost where officers monitored the feeds, radios crackling with updates. They're at the east barrier, pushing hard, western side holding for now. Shots fired near 9th and Olive, not ours. JD listened, absorbing it all, measuring what each report meant not just for the map, but for the men and women holding that map's fragile lines. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here. And as JD looked out over the barricades, past the flickering fires, past the angry faces, past the noise meant to break resolve, he felt the weight of the moment settle once more. The next hour will decide more than a night. It will decide what kind of nation we are when tested. And as the barricades shook under the pressure of the mob, JD Vance stood firm, ready to meet the storm. Inside the command post, the pressure was tangible, like the air itself had thickened, with the weight of too many voices, too many possibilities. The outside roar of the crowd, the pounding of fists against barricades, the rising pitch of sirens, all of it seeped through the walls, a relentless reminder that the storm J.D. Vance had braced for was now at the gates. Around him, the room was alive with argument, concern, and calculation. "We need to pull back from the hotel perimeter before this gets worse," one advisor urged, leaning over the map, finger tracing fallback positions. "If we stay too long, we risk escalating the violence. Let the local authorities step in." "Step in?" another snapped, his voice edged with disbelief. "They haven't stepped in all night. If we retreat, we abandon those families. We abandon the agents holding that line. Sir, if we hold this position and things spiral, we could be looking at national headlines framing this as federal overreach. This could turn public opinion, not just here, but everywhere," came a calmer voice from JD's political advisor. His tone was measured, but beneath the surface was a current of fear. Fear not just of violence, but of consequences beyond the streets of Los Angeles. JD listened, eyes fixed on the glowing map, where red indicators pulsed like warning lights on a battlefield. He heard the arguments, felt the weight of every word. They weren't wrong, not entirely. A wrong move tonight could spark something far larger, something harder to contain. But as he traced the path of the advancing mob, as he thought of the families barricaded in their hotel rooms, of the agents and Marines standing guard, he knew what was at stake was more than strategy. The voices around him blurred, as his own thoughts came clear, cold, and certain. A retreat here would be surrender, not to protesters, but to fear. And fear, he knew, once given ground, never stopped asking for more. He straightened, the debates falling quiet as eyes turned toward him. His voice was firm, no longer a suggestion but a decision. We hold because law means nothing if we run from the moment it's tested. We hold because those families deserve to sleep tonight without wondering if they've been left behind. We hold because a nation that bows to fear at its own doorstep forgets who it is. The room fell still, tension no less heavy but now shaped by resolve. Orders resumed, clearer, sharper. Positions were reinforced, medics readied, comms checked. JD stepped away from the map, moving toward the exit where the cold night waited beyond the doors. As he reached for his gear, a Marine captain, young but hardened by nights like this, approached, voice low enough that only JD could hear. "We needed to hear that, sir. All of us." JD met his gaze, nodded once. "Then let's make it count." And as he stepped back out into the night, the sounds of the storm swelling again around him, J.D. Vance felt the weight of choice settle not as a burden, but as a purpose worth holding the line for. The night deepened, and with J.D.'s decision made, the command post moved as one. No more debate, no more doubt. Outside, the sounds of boots on asphalt, the clatter of barriers dragged into place, the mechanical growl of vehicles repositioning filled the air. The barricades were reinforced, steel and concrete layered where before there had only been temporary defenses. Floodlights flickered to life, casting stark white beams over federal buildings, now marked as the last line of defense. Against the dark canvas of the city in flames, they glowed like beacons, symbols that order still stood, if only barely. JD moved through it all, his presence steadying, his eyes everywhere at once. He saw the agents checking their weapons with grim focus, Marines repositioning with crisp efficiency, medics setting up stations in shadows behind the front line. The tension was no less than before, but now it carried purpose, the purpose of those who know where they stand and why they stand there. In the mobile command post, JD paused at the central table, clearing it of cluttered reports and scattered maps. He pulled a legal pad toward him, the paper stark and empty under the harsh lights. For a long moment, he stared at the blank page, the sounds of the city's anguish just beyond the walls pressing in. Then, with slow precision, he began to write. These wouldn't be just words. They would need to cut through the roar of the crowd, the haze of smoke, the weight of fear. They would need to remind the city and the nation what still mattered when everything else seemed to burn. He scribbled, paused, crossed out lines, rewrote. His mind raced ahead to the moment when he would have to step into the storm not with armor, but with conviction, and speak words that might, just might, turn the tide. Outside, the chants rose, closer now, louder, carried on the wind like the hum of an oncoming wave. No justice, no peace, no border, no nation. The mob pressed in, their voices raw, their fury fed by the night's darkness and the city's despair. JD could feel it even inside the post. That moment approaching when the barricades would be more than just steel and concrete. They would be the line between order and collapse. He finished a final note, folded the paper once, and slid it into his jacket. His gaze swept the room one last time, taking in his team. Faces tense but resolute, hands steady on radios, eyes watching the feeds as the red zones tightened around them. The night's climax was no longer coming. It was here. JD stepped toward the door, the cold breath of the night seeping through the cracks. And as the city's fires flickered on the horizon and the mob's chants shook the air, he felt the weight of what was about to begin. Not just a defense of buildings or people, but of the very idea that even in the darkest hour, words and courage could still stand against chaos. The night's cold seemed sharper as JD stepped out from the command post, the paper with his notes a thin weight against his chest, far lighter than the burden in his mind. The city's roar swelled as he approached the platform, a makeshift structure of steel and plywood set before the FBI headquarters, now bathed in the stark glare of floodlights. The spotlights found him, casting his shadow long against the battered building behind. The riotous noise surged like a storm, voices layered in rage, frustration, despair, and something deeper, a hunger for someone, anyone, to take control of this night. JD climbed the short steps, boots heavy against the hollow wood, and faced the tide that had come to the city's heart. His eyes swept the crowd beyond the barricades, a sea of faces half lost in smoke and flickering firelight. He saw protesters, some masked, fists raised high, their voices raw from hours of chanting. He saw fear behind the fury in their eyes and purpose twisted by desperation. He saw ICE agents and Marines at the barricades, standing shoulder to shoulder, young and old, backs straight, weapons lowered but ready, their faces drawn tight with the weight of duty. He saw his team at the edges of the platform, watching, waiting, their trust placed in the words he was about to give voice. The spotlight heat mingled with the cold of the night, and for a heartbeat, everything felt suspended. The noise, the movement, the weight of the city's gaze. JD drew in a breath, deep and slow, tasting the smoke on the air, feeling the tremor beneath the noise, the tremor of a city at the edge. Then his voice broke through, cutting clean across the din, reaching into that charged space between chaos and hope. Los Angeles, once a jewel, now bloodied by betrayal. The words echoed, carried farther than he'd thought possible, the microphones feeding his voice over loudspeakers set to pierce the storm. The crowd didn't fall silent, not yet, but the rhythm of its chants faltered, as if the sheer force of being addressed, of being seen, shifted the current for a breath. JD pressed on, his voice steady, each word chosen to strike through fear, anger, and the walls people had thrown up to shield themselves from the truth. This city, your city, was meant to shine as a promise of law, of fairness, of safety for those who work hard and ask only for peace. But tonight that promise bleeds because those sworn to guard it turned away, leaving you to be used, leaving you to be hurt. He paused just long enough for the weight of those words to settle, to give space for their sting and their truth. The spotlight swung over the crowd, catching faces in sharp relief, young, old, furious, bewildered. And JD met them with his gaze, refusing to look away. We stand here not as enemies, not as occupiers, but as those who will not let this city fall. We stand for your neighbors, for your children, for those huddled tonight in fear behind locked doors, waiting for someone to remember them. The crowd's noise thinned further, confusion mingling with anger, the certainty of rage beginning to fracture under the weight of unexpected words. JD could feel it, the subtle shift, the pause between chants, the first crack in a wall built of fury. And as he looked out over the sea of faces, as the floodlights cut through the smoke, J.D. Vance stood tall against the storm, knowing that every word from here would decide what the dawn might look like. The first ripple of quiet that J.D.'s opening words had carved into the storm of voices gave him the space he needed, just enough space for truth to cut deeper. He drew breath again, feeling the heat of the spotlights, the weight of the night pressing harder. His voice, when it rose once more, carried with it a sharpness honed by frustration, duty, and the certainty that someone had to speak what so many feared to say. Your city bleeds because those entrusted to protect it turn their backs. The governor, the mayor, they stood by, watching as the streets fell to ruin. They encouraged policies that tore at the heart of law, that opened doors wide to chaos, and then turned those same policies into shields to hide behind while their people suffered. Faces in the crowd shifted. Chants faltered further. Some fists lowered, some eyes narrowed, uncertain whether to rage or to listen. J.D. pressed on, voice steady, building not in volume alone, but in conviction. They enabled lawlessness by design. They welcomed illegal crossings, overwhelmed your services, and then blamed the results on anyone but themselves. And when federal agents, when Marines, when officers sworn to protect this land, stood their ground, those leaders made them targets for violence, for hatred, for the fear that they themselves had stoked. J.D.'s words seemed to echo between the buildings, carried by the night wind. The spotlights glinted off the tears on a frightened mother's cheek at the edge of the crowd, off the steel of a Marine's helmet as he watched from his post. The city seemed, for a heartbeat, to hold its breath. But these men and women, these agents, these soldiers, these guardians, they didn't come here for politics. They didn't come here for glory. They stand here tonight, shoulder to shoulder, because they defend something older, greater, and far more sacred, the peace of our homes. J.D.'s voice rose, the fire in his words catching like a spark in dry grass, feeding on the raw emotion of the moment. He stepped forward, his silhouette tall against the blaze of floodlights. We didn't send these men and women to end hope. We sent them to guard it. We sent them so that the child hiding tonight behind a locked door might see morning, so that the elderly couple praying for safety might find it, so that this city, this nation, remembers that law means protection, not oppression. That duty means sacrifice, not abandonment. He paused, letting the weight of that promise settle over the crowd, letting the silence that began to spread speak louder than the chants had moments before. His eyes searched the faces before him, some still hardened in anger, some softened by reflection, many caught in that uncertain space between fury and the first stirrings of understanding. The fires of the city flickered in the distance, casting, shifting light across the scene. J.D. felt the fragile balance of the night, knew that words alone would not end what had begun, but words could open the door to something better, if spoken with truth and courage. And as the crowd stood, as the troops held their line, J.D. Vance prepared to deliver the final lines that might yet change the course of the storm. J.D.'s final words hung in the cold night air, carried by the speakers and by something older than sound, carried by truth. For a breath, perhaps two, the riotous tide before him seemed frozen, as if the city itself had paused to listen. The chants that had roared moments ago, fierce and unyielding, faltered. The rhythm broke. The words caught in throats that, for hours, had known only rage. From the platform, J.D. could see it. Subtle at first, like the first crack in ice before the break. A banner that had been held high, defiant and swaying, dipped an inch, then another, until its edge brushed the shoulder of the man who held it. Fists that had punched the air with anger now hung at sides, fingers twitching as if uncertain what shape they should take next. In faces shadowed by firelight and flickering flood lamps, J.D. saw the shift. Not surrender, not yet peace, but reflection. The dawning awareness that there might be more to this night than fury. The city's heartbeat changed. The roar of the crowd became a murmur, a wave of confused voices that washed over itself, caught between what had been and what might be. And into that silence, something new rose. It started at the barricade, a single voice at first, then two, then a dozen, until it swelled into a chant not of division, but of unity. USA, USA! The sound rolled across the square, filled the space between platform and crowd, between fear and hope. Troops who had stood ready for the worst now stood tall, their voices steady, their eyes fierce with purpose, not born of battle, but of belief. JD felt the chant vibrate through the platform, through his bones, through the very air of the city that had seemed so lost just moments before. He saw its effect ripple outward, protesters lowering their signs, some stepping back, others exchanging glances heavy with questions they hadn't dared ask until now. He didn't smile. There was no victory yet, only a chance, a sliver of possibility in the pause of the storm. But in that pause, JD felt the night change. The chaos had not vanished, the danger had not passed, but the momentum had shifted. And that shift, he knew, was everything. The spotlight swept the crowd, catching faces no longer contorted by rage, but softened by the weight of words that had reminded all of them, what this place, this flag, this promise had been meant to stand for. JD drew a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs, mingling with the heat of adrenaline and resolve. He stepped back from the microphone, letting the chant rise higher, letting the power of it belong to the people, to the troops, to the city itself. And as USA, USA filled the night, louder than sirens, stronger than fire, JD Vance stood on that platform not as a commander, not as a politician, but as one voice among many who chose to meet the storm with courage, and in doing so gave the city a chance to remember its strength. The chant of USA, USA still echoed as JD stepped back from the platform, his eyes sweeping the crowd now caught in its own storm. Not of rage, but of doubt, division, and dawning choices. What had been one voice of fury fractured before him, as if the words spoken, the chant taken up, had cracked something beneath the surface of anger. Protesters who moments ago had shouted in unison now turned to one another, their voices sharp, their gestures fierce, not toward the troops or the platform, but toward each other. Some argued that enough was enough, that the point had been made, that the risk was too great, that this wasn't what they came for. Others clenched their banners tighter, voices rising again in defiance, unwilling to let go of the night's fury, unwilling to let calm steal what felt like the only power they'd known in these streets. JD watched it unfold, standing steady on the platform as the floodlights swept over faces. Faces now marked by conflict not with him or the agents at the barricades, but within themselves. He saw a woman in a torn sweatshirt plead with a man beside her to step back, her hands open in desperation. He saw the man shove past, eyes burning, unwilling to let the fire die. He saw groups break apart, clusters forming, some drifting back toward the edges of the square, others pushing forward, their chants ragged, their fury unspent. From the edges of the scene came a new tension, the tension of uncertainty. The energy of the crowd no longer flowed in one direction. It swirled, eddied, collided with itself, like a river meeting stone. And in that collision, JD knew was the tipping point, the moment where the city might pull itself back from the edge or be swept over. He stepped down from the platform, moving toward the temporary command post, boots crunching over glass and debris, the chant fading behind him into confused murmur. Inside, the hum of radios and the flicker of screens greeted him like an old rhythm. Commanders leaned over maps, tracked feeds, listened to reports crackling through static. The tension inside was no less than outside, but it was the tension of waiting, of bracing, of watching history teeter on its edge. "Sir," an officer called, voice measured but with a thread of hope woven through. "We're seeing tensions cooling at key sites. East barricade, groups pulling back. Western perimeter, smaller pockets, scattered." JD leaned over the map, watching as red markers paused, then thinned, then shifted. The live feeds confirmed it. Clusters of protesters stepping away, arguments breaking out, momentum lost. The fires still burned, but their glow no longer seemed to light the city's fall. He let out a slow breath, the weight in his chest easing, if only by a fraction. The night was not over. The danger had not passed, but the tide had shifted. And now what came next would decide if that shift became salvation or only a brief pause before the storm found its second wind. Outside, the square remained charged, but different now. Less a single storm, more the meeting of many smaller ones, each with its own uncertain path. And as JD looked again to the horizon, to the city beyond this square, beyond this night, he knew the hardest decisions still lay ahead. The command post hummed with cautious hope as JD Vance and his team watched the feeds, the tide of chaos seemingly beginning to ebb. But even as reports trickled in of groups dispersing, of chants losing their bite, the storm proved it had not spent its final force. A voice crackled through the radio, sharp and urgent. "Sir, movement at the east side, small group breaking from the crowd, heading fast toward the federal lot. They're armed with clubs, shields. Some look like they have got incendiaries." JD's eyes snapped to the feed. There in stark black and white from the drone's view, a cluster of figures peeled from the main body of protesters, moving with dangerous purpose. They darted between barricades and abandoned vehicles, closing the distance to federal property with alarming speed. The room tensed. Advisors spoke at once. "We need to push them back now. Authorizing force could turn the crowd violent again. Sir, if they breach the lot..." JD lifted a hand, silencing the clash of voices. His gaze stayed fixed on the screen, his mind racing, measuring options in the breath between seconds. He felt the weight of a city's fragile hope balancing on a knife's edge. His order came, firm and without room for doubt. "We defend. Hold the line, no provocation. They cross that barrier, we contain. But we will not fire first. We will not be the spark that reignites this city's fury." The command went out, rippling across radios, into earpieces, through the ranks at the barricades. JD could see it on the feeds. Troops tensing, adjusting position, weapons low but ready, hearts pounding as the rogue group closed in. Outside, the square seemed to hold its breath. The rogue group's shouts grew louder as they neared the line. Taunts, threats, the clatter of their makeshift weapons against fences and vehicles. The floodlights caught their faces, masks of anger and defiance. But behind that JD sensed desperation, the reckless determination of those who had chosen the path of no return. Seconds stretched, each heartbeat an eternity. The group reached the outer barrier, hands gripping the steel, shaking it, testing it, daring it to fall. The troops held steady, their discipline a wall stronger than concrete. JD's knuckles whitened on the edge of the console as he watched, knowing that one wrong move, one twitch of a trigger finger, could undo everything they'd fought for tonight. And then, as if the moment itself grew weary of its tension, the storm broke. The rogue group, finding no weakness, no overreaction to exploit, faltered. Their energy bled away beneath the unwavering stare of those who refused to give them their excuse. A leader among them hurled his club to the ground with a curse, spat toward the line, and turned. One by one they followed, retreating into the shadows from which they'd come. Inside the command post, the room exhaled as one. JD let his grip ease, his heartbeat slowing, his mind already leaping ahead to the next moment, the next risk, the next choice that would demand everything of him. The radios crackled again. Rogue group dispersing. No breach, no engagement. JD's gaze stayed on the screen for a long beat, watching as the square settled again into uneasy calm. The dangerous gambit had passed, but the night was not over. And as he straightened, ready for whatever came next, he knew this. Restraint had been the weapon that saved the line tonight, and with it, perhaps, the soul of the city. The first faint light of dawn began to creep across the bruised sky, softening the edges of a city that had spent the night on the edge of ruin. The fires that had raged so brightly now burned low, their embers smoldering beneath thin ribbons of smoke that curled lazily into the morning air. Sirens still echoed, but less urgently, as if even the machinery of response felt the shift in the night's terrible rhythm. From his place inside the command post, JD Vance watched the feeds as they refreshed. Block by block, the red markers that had filled the maps like bleeding wounds faded to yellow, then green. The rogue group that had tried to ignite the final spark of destruction had melted away into the city's shadows. The larger crowd, its fury spent, had thinned until it was no longer a mob, but only scattered souls drifting homeward with the weight of the night heavy on their shoulders. JD stepped out into the dawn's cool breeze, the taste of smoke and exhaustion sharp on the air. Around him his team gathered, faces pale with fatigue, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, shoulders slumped beneath the invisible burden they had carried. But beneath that weariness was something steadier, stronger, the knowledge that when the storm had come, they had not faltered. He moved among them, offering a word here, a hand on a shoulder there. At last he stopped, facing them as the first full light of morning brushed the battered buildings and scorched streets. His voice was quiet, but in the stillness it carried. You held the line, for the city, for the families who slept behind locked doors, for the agents and officers who stood with you, and for all of us. For a moment no one spoke. The silence was not heavy now. It was full, rich with the shared relief of those who had faced the worst and together seen it pass. A Marine shifted his weight, wiped soot from his cheek. An ICE agent lowered his weapon, finally letting his hands rest at his sides. Above them, the flag over the FBI headquarters stirred in the dawn breeze, its colors dulled by smoke but unburned, unbroken. It rippled against the softening sky, as if it, too, had held the line. The smoke that had choked the skyline began to clear, revealing the city beyond. Scarred, yes, but standing. JD let his gaze follow the flag's movement, his mind already turning to the tasks ahead, rebuilding, reckoning, remembering. But for this moment, he allowed himself to simply be, to breathe the same morning air as those who had stood with him through the night, to feel the fragile peace they had secured together. And as the light strengthened, washing the city in golden ash, J.D. Vance knew that the victory they had won tonight would not be marked by parades or headlines, but by the simple, quiet truth that when the test came, they had answered it, and they had endured. The morning light revealed what the night had tried to hide. As J.D. Vance moved through the city's scarred streets, the damage spoke louder than any siren had hours before. Storefronts once bright with promise were now hollowed, their windows shattered, their signs blackened with soot. Walls that had boasted murals of hope bore fresh scars of graffiti, anger scrawled over art. Sidewalks were littered with debris, glass, charred wood, torn banners trampled beneath the weight of the night's fury. But beneath the ruin, life stirred. J.D. saw it in the shopkeeper who swept broken glass from his doorstep, his movements slow but determined. In the mother who stepped from a battered doorway, child in her arms, blinking against the dawn as if seeing the city anew. In the officers and agents who stood at their posts still, weary but unbroken. J.D. stopped often, speaking softly with those he passed. At one corner, a young Marine, his face streaked with grime, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion, gripped his rifle too tightly. J.D. approached, resting a hand lightly on the man's shoulder. The Marine's voice when it came was low, almost ashamed. "Sir, I was scared last night. I thought we'd lose it all." J.D. met his gaze without judgment, only understanding. "Courage isn't about not being scared," he said quietly. "It's about standing your ground anyway. And you did." The Marine nodded, some of the tension easing from his stance. J.D. moved on, past burned-out vehicles, past walls still warm from the night's fires. At a small shop with a cracked window and a door hanging from one hinge, a shopkeeper worked to prop the door open. His hands trembled, from fatigue, from shock, from both. J.D. stopped, offered to help. Together they lifted the door, wedging it with a broken plank. The shopkeeper exhaled shakily, glancing at J.D. with red-rimmed eyes. "I didn't think I'd see morning, sir," he said, voice thick with emotion. "But you and your people? You held the line. You gave us this chance." J.D. shook his head gently. "You gave it to yourself. We only helped you claim it." They shared a quiet moment, the kind that binds without words, before J.D. continued on. Everywhere he went, J.D. saw both the damage and the resilience, the cost of the night and the promise of the day. The city had not been saved in the grand, sweeping way stories are often told. But as JD looked at the faces of those rebuilding, at the small acts of kindness exchanged among strangers, at the steady hands clearing debris from shared streets, he saw something truer. We didn't save a city. We saved its chance to heal. The thought stayed with him as he made his way back toward the command post. The city's sounds were different now. Not the clash of violence, but the hum of cleanup, the murmur of conversation, the clatter of tools. Above it all, the flag at the FBI headquarters caught the morning breeze. Its edges frayed, its colors dulled, but still it flew, as stubborn as the people below. JD paused at the steps of the building, looking back once more at the battered but standing streets. The night's fire had left its mark, but the city remained. And now the harder work would begin, not to rebuild walls, but to restore faith. Even as the city streets began to clear of debris and the first cautious signs of recovery appeared, another storm gathered. Not in the alleys or squares, but on screens, in headlines, and across the airwaves. The media frenzy ignited as fiercely as the fires that had lit the night before. Commentators debated, talking heads filled the air with accusation and defense, and the spin machines of local officials turned at full force. From City Hall, the mayor released a carefully worded statement. While we appreciate the federal government's concern, it is undeniable that the heavy-handed presence of federal forces escalated tensions during an already volatile situation. The governor echoed it in his own address, framing J.D. Vance's arrival not as a stabilizing force, but as an intrusion that turned protests into near disaster. Clips from the night flooded social media, some framed to show troops in rigid lines, spotlights glaring, faces tense as if poised for confrontation. Others showed JD's speech, but selectively edited, pulling lines from their context to suggest aggression rather than the call for unity it had been. JD watched the coverage from the temporary command center, his expression steady, his focus undisturbed by the storm of opinions swirling outside. He knew this moment would come. He had not stood on that platform to win favor. He had stood to stop a city from tearing itself apart. When the press conference was called, cameras packed the space, reporters pressing forward, their voices loud with the hunger for sound bites, for admissions, for conflict. JD stepped to the podium, the backdrop behind him plain. The American flag, scorched at its edge but still standing, much like the city beyond. His voice when he spoke was calm, measured, the same voice that had steadied troops and agents through the night. No one wins in chaos. There were no victors in what happened here, only losses we fought to stop. We didn't come to Los Angeles to escalate anything. We came because lives were at risk. Property, yes. Institutions, yes. But more than that, the lives of families trapped behind barricades, of agents marked for harm, of a city teetering on the edge of something none of us should ever want to see. Reporters called out questions, some sharp with accusation. JD raised a hand gently, not to silence, but to guide. This wasn't about politics, not last night, not this morning. This was about duty, about standing where others stepped back. Even as the questions continued, as headlines pre-wrote their judgments, a new update crossed the wires. The Ninth Circuit had issued its ruling, upholding the federal government's actions in the city. The decision was clear. The deployment of federal resources had been lawful, necessary under the circumstances, and conducted with appropriate restraint. The news filtered through the crowd of reporters, shifting the tone, softening the edges of some questions, hardening the resolve in JD's stance. He finished, the law matters. The law protects. And last night, it protected this city. We don't stand here claiming victory. We stand here grateful that what could have been far worse was not. As the cameras clicked, as the reporters jotted notes and filed their updates, JD stepped back from the podium. The political fallout would continue. He knew that. But so too would the truth endure. When the storm came, they had not turned away. They had stood their ground. The cameras had turned away. The headlines continued to swirl. But for J.D. Vance, the work of the night was far from done. The political storm might rage in studios and on screens, but here on the ground was where the real cost lay. Not in words, but in wounds, in weariness, in the quiet courage of those who had endured. J.D. moved through the medical tents first, the air thick with antiseptic and the low murmur of voices. Cots lined the space, some occupied by agents and Marines who bore the marks of the night's violence. Bruises darkening beneath the skin, bandages stained where glass or stone had found its mark, eyes heavy with fatigue but still sharp with purpose. He stopped at each cot, offering a word, a nod, a grasp of a hand that said what words could not. One ICE agent, his arm in a sling, tried to sit straighter as JD approached, as if determined that no injury would diminish his sense of duty. JD knelt briefly beside him. "You stood when it mattered most. We won't forget that." Outside the tents, the morning sun cast long shadows over the city's scars. JD walked to the perimeter of the hotel where families had hidden through the night. The memories of fear etched into their faces, even as relief now mingled with it. He spoke to parents who had pressed their children close in the dark, to spouses who had waited breathless for a knock at the door that might mean safety or loss. It was in one of these quiet conversations that a small voice drew him down to one knee. A girl no older than 6 stepped forward, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes wide and earnest. She wrapped her arms around JD, small and fierce, and spoke with the simple clarity only a child could offer. "Thank you for keeping Daddy safe." For a moment, the weight of the night, of every choice made, every risk taken, every fear faced, seemed to gather in that tiny embrace. JD felt it settle heavy in his chest, not as a burden, but as a reminder. He rested a hand gently on her shoulder, his voice low, his promise firm. "We must be worthy of that thanks," he said, more to himself than to her, but the girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood far more than her years should allow. As he rose, JD let his gaze sweep the scene. The family stepping out into the light after a night of shadows, the agents standing guard but easing their stance as the city began to breathe again. The cost had been high. There were wounds that would take time to heal, both seen and unseen. But in this moment, there was also something fragile and precious, the chance to begin that healing. He made his way back toward the command post. The city sounds different now. Less the clamor of fear, more the quiet hum of a place taking its first tentative steps toward normalcy. And as JD walked, he carried the weight of the girl's words with him, as steadying as any order given, as binding as any oath sworn. For the work was not over. The night's battle had been won, but the battle for trust, for unity, for peace, that would take longer. And JD Vance knew he would meet that challenge with the same resolve that had seen them through the storm. The city's first light crept over the horizon, soft and gold, washing across the battered streets and buildings that had withstood the storm. The fires were out now, their smoke thinned to wisps that trailed lazily into the morning sky. What had seemed only hours before, like the end of something precious, now looked, in the glow of dawn, like the beginning of something harder, but worth fighting for. JD Vance stood on the steps of the FBI headquarters, his hands resting on the worn railing, his eyes tracing the slow, deliberate movement of workers below. The city was waking, but not to chaos, instead to purpose. Men and women swept glass from sidewalks, their brooms scraping softly in the quiet. Others painted over hateful graffiti, their brushes steady as they reclaimed the walls. Fences bent by the weight of the night's fury were lifted and reset, post by post. The flag above him stirred gently in the breeze, its edges still frayed, its colors dulled by the smoke. But it flew, defiant, enduring, unbroken. JD let his gaze linger on it a moment longer before turning his attention back to the scene below. He watched as 2 workers lifted a piece of a sign that had fallen, setting it carefully aside, as if even the fragments deserved respect. A boy, no older than 10, helped his father gather scattered debris, his small hands clutching bits of torn fabric and paper with a solemnity beyond his years. "This is what resilience looks like," JD thought, the words settling in his mind as firmly as any order he'd given. It wasn't the speeches or the barricades that defined the night's end. It was this, the quiet work of healing, the unglamorous labor of restoring what had been broken, the shared effort of people who, despite fear and loss, chose to stay, to stand, to rebuild. Behind him, the building still bore its scars, windows cracked, walls smudged with soot, steps chipped where debris had struck. But it too stood. Like the city, it remained a symbol not of untouched strength, but of tested endurance. JD drew a breath, the morning air cool and clean in a way the night smoke had tried to steal. He felt the weight of the hours behind him, the decisions, the tension, the narrow paths walked between action and restraint. But in this moment, he allowed himself something rare, a quiet certainty that the line they'd held, the risks they'd taken, had given the city this chance. He stepped down from the headquarters, moving slowly toward the square, where the worst of the night had played out. As he walked, those working paused to nod, to offer a quiet, "Thank you, sir," or simply to meet his gaze with their own, filled not with blame or expectation, but with shared relief. JD returned each gesture, knowing that the work ahead would demand as much courage as the night behind. The city's dawn had come, scarred but standing, and now together they would see what daylight could bring. As the city's hum returned, the sound of hammers striking nails, of brooms sweeping away the night's debris, of voices greeting a new day with caution but hope, JD Vance stepped inside the command post one final time. The space was quieter now, the radios no longer crackling with urgent orders, the maps no longer crowded with red markers of danger. But there was one last task JD knew he had to complete before the city and its people moved fully into the day ahead. He sat before a simple camera, no teleprompter, no backdrop, but the worn walls of the place where decisions had been made and a city's fate had turned. The technician gave a small nod and the red light blinked on. JD looked directly into the lens, his voice calm, his words deliberate, meant not for headlines but for hearts. We don't rescue nations with empty promises. We don't restore faith with speeches or slogans. We do it with courage, the kind shown in the darkest hour, when no one is watching, when no credit is expected. That's what I saw here. That's what held the city together, and that's what will carry us forward. He paused, letting the weight of the truth settle. His eyes were tired but steady. I saw Marines, agents, officers who stood not because it was easy, but because it was right. I saw citizens who, after fear and fury, chose to help instead of harm. I saw what America can be at its best, and must be if we are to endure. The work ahead will be long. The scars will not fade overnight, but we will heal together, and we will do it not with empty words, but with acts of courage, large and small, every day. The recording ended, and the message was sent. Within hours, the video spread, first through official channels, then across social media, then carried by news outlets. It was shared by soldiers stationed far from home, watched by families who had spent the night praying for safety, replayed in classrooms, living rooms, and command centers. And in that message, simple but resolute, JD's words found their mark. They reminded a shaken nation that strength is not in never falling, but in rising, in standing, and in choosing to be better together. The message had been sent, the words carried far beyond the city's borders, but JD Vance remained where it all began. The city stirred now with the sounds of renewal, hammers striking nails, voices trading plans, trucks rumbling through streets cleared of debris. Yet for this moment, JD stepped away from the bustle, seeking a quiet that spoke more powerfully than the noise of recovery. He walked alone across the square, boots scuffing over cracked concrete and ash-softened ground. The cool of morning clung to the air, but already the sun climbed, casting long golden rays that turned the scars of the night into paths of light. Ahead, the flag flew, high above the FBI headquarters, its edges frayed, its stripes dulled by smoke and soot, but still it flew. JD reached it, standing beneath its slow, steady ripple. He lifted a hand, fingers brushing the fabric's worn edge, feeling the texture of resilience woven into each thread. His gaze traced its movement against the morning sky, blue and wide, promising. A quiet reflection rose in his chest, unspoken but clear as the dawn around him. We held the line. Now we build beyond it. He stood there, letting that truth settle. Not a victory shouted or paraded, but a promise made and kept in the hardest of hours. The line had held because good people chose duty over fear, hope over hate, And now came the greater test: to build, to heal, to prove that the courage shown in darkness could light the way forward. Slowly, JD turned from the flag, his eyes sweeping the city that stretched before him. Battered buildings, walls scrubbed clean of the night's graffiti, families emerging into the day with cautious hope. Workers lifted beams, reset fences, repainted signs. The city bore its wounds, but it also bore the promise of what could come next, if they chose to rise together. JD took a step, then another, his path leading him forward into the morning light. There were no speeches left to give, no orders left to issue, only the quiet work of walking into what came next, of standing as one among many determined to see the promise through. And as the city breathed under the new sun, JD Vance walked toward it, steady, resolved, ready to help build beyond the line they had held. This story reminds us that true leadership shines not in moments of comfort, but in the heart of crisis. JD's choices showed that courage, restraint, and hope can guide a city through its darkest hour. It's not about one man, but about what we choose to stand for together. What would you have done if you were in his place? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in conversations like this. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.